Okay, so you guys can see me well, I hope.
Yep.
Good. So I decided we had been talking a little bit about uh, backswimmers one day at the club. So I thought I would tie a couple of different backswimmer patterns. I know there are backswimmers around Victoria because the lady who lives across the street from us has what used to be a koi pond in the back of her yard. And I've been there uh, and looked in her pond, and there are definitely backswimmers in that pond at different times of the year. So I thought I'd tie a couple of different patterns. And if anybody ever runs across birds feeding on the surface and you can't figure out what they're feeding on because you're not seeing any flying insects, it might be backswimmers. I know in Alberta in the fall you get a fall of backswimmers where they're going to go and lay eggs on the bottom of the lake, and these things would fly around and then they'd go down and hit the water like a pellet and then swim like crazy for the bottom. And if you saw that happening, you would definitely get a backswimmer pattern and fire it out into where the birds were diving, and you would catch a few nice trout that way. I haven't seen that here, so maybe it's not a pattern for here, but certainly I know there are backswimmers around. The first one I'm going to tie here is one that has a bit of a shiny back, and it's got a little fuzz on the bottom. And the critical thing is the legs. So we'll start with this one. The hook is this guy here. It's basically a TMCO number 8. You could tie them a little smaller, but my thumbs are too big for tie much smaller than number 8s on these. It's just a TMC standard 100 fly hook. And the main thing is that it's got a bead on it, and the bead is just a little guy. It's a 7/64 black bead, and the purpose of the bead is to help position the legs properly so that they stick out properly, and also to provide a little weight so that the fly goes a little nose down when you're trying to strip it. I'm going to use, for this one, I'm going to use a A-dot thread, just because things get a little tight as you get this pattern finished. The first thing I'm going to do is tie on right behind the eye of the hook. And I'm going to come back about the bead width behind the eye, because you need a place in front of the bead to tie down the back. And when I get that on there, I'm going to build a bump in front of the bead to keep it from sliding forward and jamming up the eye. I'm going to build a big bump right in front of the bead. That will keep it from moving forward. Need to get quite a few wraps to fill in so the hole is filled. Then I'll go in behind the bead and wrap a good chunk of thread in behind the bead to keep it from sliding backwards. So that fixes the bead kind of at the front of the fly in one place. Okay, so we have to build this thing in reverse, except for the legs. The legs are these guys there. You could use black rubber legs. This is stuff I picked up at Robinson. It's speckled and black. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie it in behind the bead, a little bit back where the bead is. And I'll tie it so that there's one half of the rubber leg on the far side of the hook. Wrap back a little bit. And then bring the leg forward and tie on the other leg on the near side of the hook. And I'll hold these guys up a bit so that now you can see the legs kind of go forward at a V-shaped angle. I'm going to trim them just a little shorter so they're not in the way. So there's your V-shaped legs. Sometimes you got to get a couple of good wraps in here so that they're going to stay where you want them. And then the next thing is I want the flashback that's going to go over top of everything. And I will come down the shank of the hook about halfway. And this flashback it's going to give it a little bit of shine over the top of the back of the fly. And this stuff is called lateral scale. You can just use plain mylar that's a little bit, sort of 1/8 of an inch wide. And I'll wrap that right down the hook shank all the way down to the bend, sitting it on top of the hook and sort of wrapped around the hook until I get right back just slightly around the bend where the barb on the hook was. By the way, I did debarb that beforehand. Okay, so there's the flashback out of the way. And then the next thing we're going to tie on is the back. And the backing material is Peacock Herl. I will get a bunch of Peacock Herl and probably 6 or 8 strands of Peacock Herl, because I need some bulk and some width to make back properly. And so I'll take them all and get them all together in a nice clump like that. Trim the ends off. Put my thread back up to behind the bead. And I'll tie them in, the butts in just behind the bead. That helps force those little legs forward a bit. And then I'll hold them up and wrap down on top of the hook. Right back to where the mylar has been tied in at the bend. Hold that out of the way. Come up a little bit, right behind the bead again. And the body is just this herring micro UV polar chenille, something that's got a little bit of flash to it and a little bit of furry stuff sticking out. And I'll tie that on there right behind the bead again. And I will wrap that back to the thread back to the starting point again, right at the back. Bring the thread forward again, go over top of the bead and right up to the eye of the hook. And then I'll throw a little half hitch in there. This is to make winding the body up easier. Get my bobbin rest there. And then I'll hold the micro chenille at the back and get it started right just above the bend. And I'll wrap once up the body to behind the bead. I'll wrap it back again, all the way back to the back, right at the bend, and then wrap right up to the behind the bead again. At that point, I'll take my thread, get the bobbin rest out of the way, and bring my thread back. I'm gonna take it over top of the bead and wrap right in behind the bead, tie off that chenille. Bring my thread in front of the bead again. And then I'll take this Peacock Herl without the the back, the flashback, and get that out of the way. And I would just pull that peacock herl over top of the body, right down in front of the bead. And I'll try and kind of flatten that peacock herl out a bit on the top and tie that down right behind the eye of the hook. Just leave a little space there. That's on there good and solid. Get all these peacock herl bits out of the way. Got to be careful not to snip off your legs while you're doing that. Now I'll take my mylar over the top and hold it right snug just behind the eye. Get a couple of wraps. Give it a little bit of a tug so that the mylar stays right on top of all of that peacock herl. And then wrap back over it a bit so it's tied down. And just build a teeny tiny head to make sure that that mylar is not going to disappear. And then do it finish. And I like doing the manual one for here because I don't trap the legs when I do the finish. The last thing I do is I want, you know, this is all pretty fragile stuff. So I got some thin UV set glue. And I'll just come on the top here and I will put a little bit of this UV set right down the back. And then hit that with the ultraviolet light. To set it up. And then just do another little bit of coat of this UV set glue just to make sure it's good and solid. And because that UV set does not drip down into the legs, it leaves the chenille out. So that's him. Now, if you want, you can trim the legs a little bit more to suit, but I don't mind leaving them a little long. And the nice thing about this is, I don't know if you can see with the UV light, is that this stuff really sparkles with the UV light. And particularly the shiny thing off the back has quite an interesting glint to it. So that's Backswimmer number 1. So now,
what's the technique for fishing this?
Beg pardon? What I use is a floating line with a bit of sink tip leader material between the end of the fly line. Probably 4 or 5 feet of sinking material, and then just tie it and cast it out and let it sit there for a while. And then when you strip it, the backswimmer will do this, because you've got that little bit of sinking material between the fly and the tip of the fly line.
And I assume it's a slow strip.
Yeah, because when these things come down, they hit the water with a splat, and then they start going down. So if you have an opportunity to get them to go down, and this other pattern is a little bit more like that because it's got a little more weight on it. I got a bigger bead on it. So basically, a leader that will try and pull the fly down below the water. And also, when the backswimmers are doing their leg laying thing, they will come down and go splat on the surface with a good smack. And that sometimes that's all you got to do is cast out, let it go whack on the surface, because the fish are looking up. We used to do that on a couple of the lakes just west of Edmonton when it was backswimmer season. Pretty decent fishing that way. So the next one is this foam body guy, and it's black. Black and the body and the black foam I'll show you is this thin closed cell foam, and I get a razor blade and a straight edge, razor blade and a straight edge. I lay it down and I cut a strip off of it about a 1/4 inch wide, and it's about 1/8 of an inch thick closed cell foam, so it floats really well. Then what I do with it, I get one that's probably a piece that's probably twice as long as the shank of the hook, and I will cut a point, tapered point on the end, and that enables me to tie it in on the hook shank without creating a big bulk at the back of the fly. Then I get a hook, which in this case, these are hard to come by. This is a partridge, but you can have, there are other manufacturers similar. It's a barbless shrimp hook, so it's got a bit of a curve to it. And what I want is I want to create what would be a little air bubble or a little bit of a glint in the body, because when these things are going down, they tend to trap a little air under their body, and so there's this little glint underneath. And so what I've used for that is a tungsten bead, which helps it sink a bit. And this is an 1/8 inch silver bead. So I've already used my fancy bead pliers, which I don't know if anybody wants to work with beads, you need one of these. They're a pair of tweezers that have a little hole in the end that allows you to manage the beads and get them on the hook without stabbing your hand with the hook. So I'm going to put this in the hook shank, in the hook vise, with the bead on. And I'm going to want the bead to be smack in the middle of the fly. So the same thing I'm going to do, I have more of these rubber legs. Where did I put them? Where did I put it? So they come out in this. You get a lifetime supply in one package, I'll tell you. A lifetime supply for a dozen anglers. I think this was originally a product for saltwater fly fishing flies. I'm going to use a little thicker thread. I'm going to use a 6/0 here. And so what I'll do is I'll just tie in at the eye of the hook. Now for this, again, I want to come back maybe a little less than a third of the way back hook shank to get this all tied in. So I'll take the rubber legs, I do them first, and I'll tie them about in the middle on top of the hook. And then I'll wind forward to just about, again, an eye width behind the eye. Then I'll bring the other half of the rubber leg forward, and I'll tie that on top of the hook there as well. And the idea is to get the rubber on either side of the hook shank. Bring the thread forward and pull these guys up. And I'm going to build a little dam in front of where I've got about an eye width behind the eye. And that causes the legs to do that, where they go forward on either side of the hook shank. I may need to separate that guy out. There we go. One more. trying to get them divided on top of the shank. Then I'll come back and I will, right where the rubber legs kind of end, that will keep the bead from moving forward too far. I'll go back behind the bead with the thread and do the same thing as I did with the last one, where I've got a big bulk of thread to keep the bead from sliding backwards. Then wrap down to the bend. Right back to again where the barb was, or would have been if this was a barbed hook. And at that point, I'm going to take my little pointed piece of foam and I will capture the tip of that point on top of the hook and wrap right back down and around the bend a bit, so that it's, and because I've got that thing pointed, you'll see it just where I stop, there's still a bit of the V, because I'm going to want to pull this forward over top of the back of the fly. Just back right around the bend. Now that peacock curl that I had before, I have a little remains of it. Start right behind the bead and wrap that down on top of the hook shank. And wrap back to the back. Right back to where the foam is attached. Wrap the peacock curl around the thread to reinforce it. And then I will wrap the peacock curl around the shank of the hook in behind the bead. And I'll get a fair bit on here. I want this peacock curl to be a reasonably bulky bit of body back here. And when I get that done, right up behind the bead, I will wrap it off. Trim it clear. And I'll do a quick whip finish right behind the bead. Just because if you were to just pull a peacock curl over the bead, it's possible a fish could get his little toothy in there and then cut the peacock curl, and then it would unravel. So I'm going to start back again in front of the bead with the thread. Get another few strands, 3 or 4 strands of peacock curl. The nice thing about the peacock curl is that it will trap some air when it's when it's dry, so it'll add to that sort of buoyant effect of the body, bubble-ish effect of the body. And then again, wrap around the thread to reinforce. And wrap a body in front all the way up to where the little legs are. Tie it off. Peacock curl out of there. Pull my legs back. All the ends properly. There we go. Pull the legs back on either side. Wrap in front of the fly, right behind the eye. And get the legs positioned on either side of the eye of the hook. And come in with your, I want to make sure those legs are headed backwards now a little bit. I need to wrap in front of them. Kind of force them back a little bit. Bring the foam over top. Pull the legs back out of the way when I'm doing this, so they're not going to get stuck. Pull the foam nice and tight on top, and then wrap over top, right behind the eye of the hook. Make sure everything is sitting there on top of the hook. And then I'll pull the foam back like that. And then I'll whip finish right in front of the eye of the hook, right behind the eye of the hook. Oop, that didn't work. Get out of the way. I prefer hand whip finish for this because I can place that wrap right where I need it. And then we'll just trim the thread out. Make sure the legs are where they belong. And then take my scissors and cut the foam off so that there's a little stubby bit that sticks out in front of the eye. And to cut the legs to length, I'm just going to pull them back a little bit and cut them a little bit more than shank length of the hook. So they stick out to the side. Come back there. Oh, there. That and a little bit of glue, just regular glue. I'll just put a dab in here. And the last thing I do is I take my bodkin and shove it in the eye of the hook to make sure I'm not filling the eye with glue. And that's him. So you have a little bit of a bead, a little bit of a glint in the middle of that furry body to look at like an air bubble that the thing has trapped on its way back down to the bottom. So that's that. And I'll do remove the spotlight for me. Where's it here? Gotta find the menu. Where are we here? I'm still playing with this interface. There we go. And now I can remove the spotlight. And Florin, you're up.
Thank you, Dave. I actually have a simple fly, so that's plenty of time. To go back to Tony's question about how to fish these things, I used to fish them. I never was on a lake when these water boatmen and backswimmers were coming down like rain. Instead, I would fish a little bit later in the fall, at least after the first frost. That would be a bit of a challenge here. And then wait for the warm-up of the weather after that first touch of frost. And miraculously, the water boatmen would start to be quite active in the shallows. And when the sun would warm that water a little bit late in the afternoon, typically around 2 p.m. or so, the trout would start actively feeding on them, and you could see the swirls close to the surface. same type of feeding activity you see when the trout go after emergers. So not right on the surface, but just under the surface. And what worked very well at that time was just using a plain, straight floating line and throwing the fly out there. It always had a bead, so it would sing on its own right.
Florin, you're very you're I don't know whether you're not close to the mic, but you can barely hear you.
That's a bit odd. Is this better?
Yes, that's a bit better.
Okay, so just use a simple floating line and let the fly sink a little bit. Sometimes you get hit just as the fly is sinking. You're not doing anything. You just threw the fly out and the fly is sinking and the fish would just hit. And sometimes you just have to strip, and you have to strip fast so you don't get caught in the weeds. Sometimes you're fishing relatively shallow water, right on top of weed beds and such, and the fish hit it in that shallow water. And it's what happens after that is very exciting, and I'm not going to get into the details. That's one thing. The second thing is a lot of people think that imitating the red eyes on the water boatman is important. I don't know if it's that important, but it adds a touch of color to the fly if you like colorful flies. So a lot of people swear by putting using actually red thread to tie their water boatman. For backswimmers, I think it's a bit less important, but with boatmen, it's quite a distinct thing. Anyway, lots of jokes about the red eyes on these bugs. Oh, and one last thing before we move on to this thing that imitates everything and nothing. These the water boatmen and the backswimmers are the only things that the biologists refer to as true bugs. And the one distinctive thing about the whole group, they're known as Hemiptera, is that they don't change throughout their life cycle. Once they emerge out of the egg, a little one is the same bug as a big one. They just molt and grow, but there is no metamorphosis in that process. So it's not like you have a larval stage and then you have a nymph and then you have a pupa or anything like that. It's just the same little bug that simply grows up. Okay, enough of that. And they're fun to tie, and you can do them as simple or as complex as you like. A generic pattern that works for this group of things is also a prince nymph. Worked for me quite well, which leads me to believe that presentation is probably the more important factor. But I've tied a bunch of these water boatmen, and they're lots of fun to tie. Okay. What I was planning to do today is a woolly worm, which is a fairly old pattern. It's an attractor, and it's one of the first flies that I learned to tie. And again, it's one of those things that you can do in as simple or as complicated a manner as you like. The standard ingredients are some kind of a red tag, wool or acrylic or whatever you have, a yellow body, and a hackle. That's, again, typically a grizzly hackle. And you can start from here and make changes. And you make as many or as few changes as you like. What I've done here is I've added a glass bead. I've added 2 lateral lines of Peacock Herl, and I've done a yellow body here. I've changed from the chenille that I used on this pattern here, You can see the difference. This is a bit fuzzier. And this one is a little bit sleeker and shinier. Okay. And to secure the hackle, which is the one fragile part, and of course the Peacock Herl is also fragile, to secure all of that, I've used a wire rib. Okay, so you can add or subtract to this as you like. Okay, and so I did this one with floss in response to Bill's earlier question about, you know, what did you use for body? On the fly that I added with the posting, I just use medium yellow chenille. You don't want the chenille to be too thick, because then everything gets deeply buried in the chenille and your fly is just an indistinct blob, unless that's the effect you're looking for. And this one is standard embroidery chenille that I put on a old empty thread spool, and I put one of these elastic bands to hold it all together. Okay, and so for this size fly, all 4 strands go to making the body. If you start to tie these things in significantly smaller sizes, you can go down to 3 strands or 2 strands. 1 strand would be for super tiny flies. Okay, and this gives you this one is has a nice kind of shiny finish. You can get this in a whole range of colors and textures, and they're metallic ones as well, and so on and so forth. Okay, the beads are just from next door to Robinson's, from that bead shop, and these are glass beads. Dave was talking about several lifetime supplies for a dozen fishermen. Yeah, I think that's kind of describes this. Okay, so let's get on with the tying. I need a hook, and I kind of like the red bead there. So although it was not part of the original recipe, I'm just gonna go ahead and put on a bead. And the process of putting on beads, let me try to see if I can demonstrate that a little bit too, because I managed to never poke myself while doing that. So what I do is I just put the bead in the palm of my hand like this. Let me try to, whoops, try here so it's actually visible on camera. So I do this, I put the bead there and catch it. Of course you can't see. Just hold it like this and catch it with the point of the hook. And that's it. Now you have the bead on the hook. Nobody got hurt. And you can continue tying. So that's how I like to do my my beads. The other alternative, if this looks a little too scary to you, is you take some kind of a soft cloth with some fuzz on it. An old towel would be good. Old kitchen towel would also work. Something with a bit of thickness to it. And you spill the beads on it, and then you catch them. You just scoop them out with the points of the hooks, and that works very well as well. And you have more, you know, you don't have to worry about poking yourself in the hand. Okay. Thread is standard black 8/0. Just start behind. If you put enough material behind the bead and push the bead well against the eye of the hook, unless the bead is too large for the hook size you're using, the bead will jam up nicely against the eye of the hook, and you're never going to have a problem with it moving. I know some people like to do a few thread wraps here to jam the bead against. Of course, you could do that. It just adds a step that I never really found to be quite necessary. So here I took another thread, did a few wraps, I never managed to somehow, I think the reason I'm not doing this is because I never gauge the number of wraps properly as to how many they're needed. And so I end up with too many or too few. So let's see if this time I'm lucky. So do a whip finish because I like to keep the threads separate between the, okay, I'm getting this out. I like to keep the threads separate in front and behind the bead, so I don't have any thread exposed across the bead. Okay, so this jams it a little bit nicer, I guess. And that exposed thread across the bead is always at risk of being cut, so that's why I don't like it. All right, so go all the way to the band of the hook, standard procedure, line up your thread with where you crimped the barb down, if your hook had a barb. If it was a barbless hook, you have to imagine where the barb would have been, and that's your happy point there. And then what I'm using in this case, I have some, I was looking for my red wool, and for some reason I couldn't find it. I have this fancy stuff called sparkle yarn, and it's a synthetic. It is quite nice and sparkly, and it's a two. I'm having a hard time deciding whether it's a two. I think it's a 3-strand material, and I don't want more than just one strand to use here for the tag. So I'm going to clip a little bit from one strand out of the 3. Now, depending on the wool or yarn you're using, you know, preferences may vary because you're going to work with different thicknesses. I'm just going to hold this between my fingers, do a pinch wrap, and then secure this to the shank of the hook. And so there's my tag. If you feel this is a little bit too long, you don't want it to be much bigger than the gap of the hook. That's kind of the rule of thumb here. And now you have to start adding things in some order. Typically, the way you do is you add materials in the reverse order in which they'll be going onto the hook shank. So the first thing to add here at the tail end will be the wire, because that's the last thing that's going to go on. I'm going to, normally if it's a fly where the body is seriously exposed and I have to do like very neat wraps, I would go all the way with the wire to behind the bead. But this is unnecessary here because I'll have a lot of fuzz and stuff to cover up the body. So I'll just attach this with a relatively short tag. Keep my thread, and you can see why I'm using 8/0 on, this is a size 8, 3906B masthead hook. So it's pretty heavy wire, it's a pretty big hook. Normally you'd be using, you know, 6/0 threads to tie on this, but in this case, I'm using the 8/0 so I don't create too much bulk with the thread. Then I take 2 strands of Peacock Herl. Those are gonna go on one side, and I clip off the end here. So this bit, that's always very fragile. I clip it off. And I attach this to one side. If you want to be very precise about positioning this, you can do something like this. You attach it a little bit in front of where you actually want it to be. And then you manipulate the peacock so that it sits exactly where you want it while you're wrapping backwards over it. So this will secure it exactly in the spot you want. And then you take the other 2 strands of Peacock and you repeat the procedure. Clip. Attach. So just loop the thread over, and then once I have it turned once around the hook, it's all secure and I can put it in. All right, so now last ingredient I need is the body, and I'm going to go back to the chenille. So here's my medium chenille. On the card, I'm just gonna free up just enough of it. So what I do is I keep it on the card and I put it here through this little notch. So now I have a working length. And the first step is, again, to prepare this for tie-in. Just strip a little bit of the fuzz from the core of the chenille, so you have something that you have enough of a length there that will allow you to attach the chenille. So you want this to be secure, and then just wrap over the rest of the materials just along the hook shank. That'll just create a little bit more of an underbody as well. All good. Okay. Now we're ready to put in the body. And here you see I have a whole mess of materials attached at the back. But the bobbin is stuck on the jaws with a little magnet, so it's gonna sit there nicely so I can turn the vise around. I don't need to do a knot. Notice I'm just letting the thread hang down, and it's fine 8/0 thread. And no problem, I just get a few extra wraps of fine thread right behind the bead. That's an easy way to use a rotary vise. You don't have to do anything too fancy. Of course, it's a lot nicer to use a bobbin rest and so on. And in some cases, it's really important. But here you can get away with just doing it the simple way. Okay. So notice also when I secure a material, I do 2 or 3 turns over it, and then I fold it back, and then I do another couple of turns in front. This way things are not gonna go anywhere. And so let me try now to do the lateral lines. Here, you just pull these things tight on the side and cross over with a thread. Tighten on your side, not the opposite side, so you don't put too much torque on the peacock, so it actually stays where you want it to be. Do your 2 wraps up front and trim. Then repeat the process on my side. I'm gonna turn the vise just a little bit so I can see better what I'm doing. Pull it here, just alongside the body of the fly. Secure, trim. Okay, now we have the fuzzy body and the 2 strands of peacock on either side. It's time to get on with the hackle. For the hackle, I have a leftover piece here of the saddle feather that I was using. And again, when you're thinking of flies and hackle and whatever, you know, we have all these rules about 1.5 times the gap size, and you can see this is barely the size of the gap on my size 8 hook. And you could get by here also with smaller hackle. What happens is the following. First of all, this is not a dry fly, so you don't have to have that 1.5 times size, the gap of the hook. The second thing is whenever you do a body on a fly and then you wind hackle over it, that adds to the finished diameter of the wrapped hackle, okay? So in this case, you will see that the fly is going to look a lot buggier, and it's going to look as if I was using much bigger hackle than I actually am. And the reason for that is because I have a fairly thick body here. And as always, I prepare my hackle by trimming a little bit here at the front, so I have something to attach the hackle, and also my first half turn of hackle is not going to get into the barbs immediately. It's going to allow the hackle to seat itself properly. Okay. So I've attached it with a couple of turns at the front there. And now I'm going to wind this hackle backwards. So one first turn goes right at the front, and then I'm going to spiral it backward. Gonna get 3, maybe 4 turns of hackle on this little guy, and finish here right at the tail where the tag is. And now I'm gonna get the wire, and I'm going to secure the hackle with the wire. And to be super safe here, you want to do like 2 turns right where you're finishing the hackle, and then wind your wire forward. And if you want to make sure, the only difficulty here is not to trap all the fibers of the hackle that you just took a lot of pains to wrap. So just wiggle the wire a bit, and the process of wiggling is going to free up the fibers so they don't get up trapped under your wire wraps. So keep wiggling and moving with the wire forward. Nice spiral wrap, and then finish right up tight against the bead, okay? If you still find yourself facing a bit of a gap here behind the bead, that's okay. Just do 1 more turn or 2 more turns, depending on how big your perceived problem is. And then secure this with a few turns of thread. Now, this being fairly fine thread and this fairly thick wire, I'm going to go 3, 4, 5 turns so that it's well secured, so I can break off the wire easily. So if you secure this properly, then the wire is not going to move anywhere when you helicopter it, and then it's easy to break off. Put the wire aside. And again, with handling the wire, there are 2 little tricks that I like to use. One is putting an elastic over the wire spool, and the other one is I'm using a little wooden peg. I believe this one's the 1/4 inch size, with some shrink tubing and a little magnet buried here at the end of this whole contraption. So what this does is the shrink tubing holds, on the one hand, holds the magnet in place. And I have 2 layers, one that holds the magnet in place, and the second layer that adds a little bit of thickness so that I can jam this inside the spool. And the beauty of it is I can stick my spool of material right on the vise. This always works because the jaws of all vices are made out of some hard tool steel. So magnets will stick to that very nicely. Okay, time for a whip finish. And here, because of all that fuzz and hackle and everything, I don't want to have any cement. So I just do a couple of whip finishes. The fly never comes off in this spot because it's a double whip finish, and B, it's well protected behind the bead. And now to finish this off, you don't want to leave this trailing. You need it to tie the next fly, because you will be tying half a dozen of these, right? It just pull on the hackle. Now sometimes the hackle stem is fine enough that just one yank will break it off. But if you don't want to take that risk of things coming unraveled when you pull too hard on the hackle, just pull on it, place your scissor here, and don't try to use the scissors other than as a blade to cut against. So just pull on both things and slice through the hackle, and that usually ends up being fairly nice and neat. And there's your finished fly. So this is kind of as complicated as I may want to do it. And you can drop from these steps whatever you like. The one thing I do have a preference for is, once I've learned how to do it, is to actually reverse wrap the hackle. This way, your hackle always looks pretty nice. It doesn't get in the way when you're tying the fly. It's the last thing you're putting on. And then the wire rib gives a whole lot of strength to any pattern where you do this, right? So this is a typical construction manner for woolly buggers, right? So it's a good kind of practicing fly to learn some important techniques, I think. And that's it for the fly. And for me, I took full advantage of the half hour and I went full long-winded here. So there you go.
Thanks, Florin. That was good.
Good. But
I have to go, gentlemen. Take care. Have a good weekend.
Just a quick note before you go. When I was looking for samples of stuff to tie, I found my box of Backswimmer patterns. But in the same box, look what's there. Same thing that he just tied, except without the red bead.
Yep, nice.
So go back in your inventory and see what you might have.
Okay, gentlemen, take care. Have a good weekend.
Take care, Mohammed.
Florin, David, thank you.
Thanks, guys. Ciao.
Thanks, guys.